So we're back. Welcome to the channel, guys. I'm Chris. Nice to be back. First of all, I'd just like to announce, new furniture. But jokes aside, I'm very fortunate to have this desk. I've just picked it up from Mr. Jack Duxbury, as you can see in countless old Anderton's videos. So thank you, Jack, for that. It's really tied the studio together. I appreciate it. But now that that's out the way, let's get on in today's video, where we shall be checking out Ableton's warp modes. Let's go. Firstly, what are these warp modes in Ableton? Well, basically, when you're dealing with any kind of audio file, the warp mode is basically the algorithm that you'd pick to help Ableton detect, whether it's drums and it needs to keep track of the transients in particular, or if it's something more complex like a vocal or even a whole song that you chuck in there. So it's using different algorithms to help kind of figure out what is the best suitable method, because they all work differently and they all sound different. So I just thought we'd break it down, run through them, see what different kind of sounds you can get from it and how you could use it in different ways. Alright, so to start this off here, I've got this drum loop up here. It sounds a little something like this. So that takes us to our first warp mode, the beats warp mode. Looks a little something like this. Now all of these warp modes are going to have different options when you go through them, but let's get started with beats. I'm just quickly going to run through the preserve section just to show you kind of what that's doing to the sound. So I've got it selected on off, which is basically it kind of runs between 2 points as it's playing. And to preserve the information in between, you can either have it run through a cycle between these points, and then it will just stop, or in this case it plays through the cycle, and then if it needs any more information it can just play again from the start, or in this case plays back and forth. So it will play one time forwards, and if it needs more information it will pull and start playing backwards, so kind of reverse the sound a bit. But for the sake of this, I'm going to leave it on just playing once and stopping, so you can hear this as I pull this fader down. The notes are going to get shorter and shorter as it pulls back that envelope. So just really quick, if you want to see how the other two modes work, if I slow down the beat, you'll hear how it's actually working with these three different preserving methods. So you can hear in that the sample length is technically the same between each hits. It doesn't necessarily slow down. It's like slowing down where the hits are placed. So when it hits the snare drum, you can hear that that release is the same as it was at full speed, but obviously there's the gap where there would normally be the space filled up. So how can I fill up that gap? Well, I can go back to this back and forth one, and so instead of just playing and then when the tail of the transient ends the sound stops, it can just reverse it a bit. You can hear that reverb going, almost kind of playing in and then reversing out to extend it. So, you've got a certain effect there, and then if you just play it where it kind of loops in the same order, you'll hear it. So a bit more kind of glitchy, I guess. Most people would probably be using the third kind of back and forth, loop back and forth method on their drums, but they're all there. You can try play with all of them, and they'll obviously provide different effects. Now, we are trying this on drums, so just to show you a point of how cool this can sound on something else, I've got the sample here, and I'm just going to put the transient on this preserve. You can see we have different divisions of time, and say I pick 1/8, and then I put this back onto loop once and then pull this down, you'll see the effect it's going to provide.
Keeping you close, I don't know it. What we had was real. Every time.
So you have this kind of stuttering effect, which Bear in mind you can kind of do to any piece of audio. In this case, I'm just using a vocal. But again, you have these different loop modes to kind of provide a different effect. And bear in mind, we're just in the beat section by this point. So let's slow it down so we can hear the difference.
Keeping you close. I don't know if what we had was real.
So, it's kind of got a bit of a glitchy effect. Obviously, on something where you'd want it a bit more pristine in terms of what the warping is doing, you probably want to use a better algorithm like Complex Pro, whatever. But we'll dive into those. Let's continue. I have got some guitar and some bass. And for the bass, I want to use tones because apparently tones is great for audio with clear pitch, such as, vocals, bass line, usually monophonic. An 808 as well, stuff like that, So let's try it. I've chucked this into tones mode on this bass line. Let's give it a listen. Great, so we've got that. So now if I slow down the track, we can actually hear what the warping is doing. And if I change its grain size, so you can hear on the higher grain size, it's kind of like you get a lot more of that separation. You kind of hear the grains, the samples in between. But when I have the grain size smaller, there's a lot less gaps in that sound. So when you're hearing all the notes, it's a lot more kind of clean together. You can almost hear it's like a really fast, like slap delay or something, when the grains are high. But, there you go. I'd actually like to try this on that vocal, see how that works.
Keeping you close. I don't know if what we had was real.
You very much get that kind of Prodigy Aphex Twinny sound when you have a slow grain size and you play with it on the vocal. Like that's very much kind of that vibe, which is great. You've got that. And so that's tones. Next, I think we'll check out texture. It's basically a similar concept. It's kind of like the Complex Pro of tones and textures, because Complex having nothing and then Complex Pro having a little something. Tones has the grain size, texture has grain size and flux. Now, obviously, grain size is kind of the size of the grains. When the grain sizes are bigger, you hear a lot more gaps in the sound. Whereas where it's smaller, it's kind of a lot more condensed. Doesn't sound like it's stretching as much. So the texture is very much similar to tones, but it's more towards polyphonic, kind of more complex sounds, noisy sounds, that type of stuff. And so obviously you've got the grain size like we have in tones, but flux now is kind of the randomness in between those grain sizes. So when we have a really big grain size and there's a lot of these kind of gaps between, it won't necessarily be as uniform. There's going to be a lot more randomness going on. So it maybe should help it kind of feel a bit more natural, but let's give it a play and see what it sounds like. Interesting. So I noticed, obviously, the flux is adding that kind of randomness. But when I said it would make it sound a lot more natural, I didn't realize that on a smaller grain size, the flux to full kind of helps bring it a lot more to that natural sound, whereas the grain size to large, when you can really hear that kind of granular sound going on, the flux at a lower number actually kind of works a bit better. It's interesting. It's even providing like this kind of chorusy effect because you get the same sound but like at different times, so you get some weird pitch variation, and it's cool. You just get an interesting sound overall. But bear in mind, if I had this guitar and I wanted to actually play it at this speed, but it sound clean and normal, like I actually recorded at the speed, I would probably put it to Complex Pro and then pull the formants down to 0 and the envelope either to 0 to full. So to me, that's probably a lot more of a usable sound as opposed to this. But you've got your options. So next is repitch. Now, this is my favorite warp mode. Yes and no, like sometimes. So just to quickly run through repitch, it's basically the algorithm used that very much emulates a vinyl player. So as you speed up or slow down the tempo or the BPM of the song, it will change the pitch accordingly. So if you slow down, it will go, or if you speed it up, you know, it's got that vibe. To show it off here real quick, I've got this guitar, and if I slow it down, you'll hear what I mean. So that's great. Obviously, the kind of issue you get with this is that you can't actually change the pitch afterwards. You can maybe apply a plugin or something to do it, but the complex issue with doing this is that it's not just turning down the pitch, you know, 1 semitone per BPM or something normal. It's actually landing somewhere in between notes at times. It might not necessarily be a G or an A, but it could be in between it, you know? So how do you account for this, and how do you actually know whether or not your sample is in key after doing this pitching? Well, what I tend to do is I've got just a regular old sine wave here. A bit of a dirty sine wave, but I've got a sine wave. I've just applied a tuner to it, and I can see that the sine wave is in C, right? So if I change this to the repitch mode, which it's already on, and I change the tempo, you're going to see this C start to shift. And that's, you know, to the same ratio. So if I was repitching a bunch of samples, it's all going to repitch at the same kind of ratio. So I could use this sine wave with this tuner to at least give me a bit of reference of where I'm actually landing note-wise. So say I've got this sample. So now for reference, if I shift this guitar track in terms of shifting the tempo of everything, I can use the tuner of this to actually show me if I'm still kind of in key. So if I play, so I know like this, at least the reference is that it's roughly tuned to G, because that's where my sine wave was landing. And if I really want to be specific and get it to land exactly on that note, I could actually do 9. Well, 62.9 is actually quite on it, but then, you know, you got to deal with all these decimal points, and who wants that? But there you got some, you know, you got some reference if you want to use your repitch mode. Personally, I really enjoy it, especially for using on like full fat samples, whole songs, or whatever that may be. Even vocals, it tends to sound really nice. Just as long as you didn't want any of that kind of granular sound, but you wanted to change the pitch or maybe the speed, you know, this is a really great option for that. All right, now lastly, the complex modes. We have Complex and Complex Pro. Again, similar to tones and textures, Complex has no features, and then Complex Pro has 2 features. So these warp modes are, I guess you could say, the best quality warp modes. If you want to change the pitch or the length of a piece of audio, these are most definitely the best. I would use one or the other, Complex or Complex Pro. Now, if I'm dealing with something quite high fidelity, say a vocal or a lead vocal, something that really needs, needs to stand out in the front and needs to sound the best, I might not necessarily use Complex Pro because maybe I want a bit more touch over the formants and envelope. But in the case of, say, like a guitar or a bass line, something I'm a bit less fussy about the formants, and kind of how it's standing in the front, I could just use Complex and it would just be like a nice quick fix. Don't have to worry about it. I just know I can put it on that. It's going to sound great. Let's actually check it out on this guitar real quick. We'll start on Complex and then I'll flip it to Complex Pro. You can see I'm on Complex and I've slowed it down 15 BPM. It sounds normal, sounds pretty fine. I'm gonna push it to like 40 BPM. We're starting at 84, so we're half the tempo by this point. Let's see how it holds up. I mean, it sounds great. You can hear it's holding it up pretty well. If I put it back onto tones, just so you can see, or texture, just so you can see what that real granular sound was doing. So going from that to this. It's a big win. So definitely would recommend that, time and place, but for anything you want to sound super high fidelity, I would go for that. Now, Complex Pro. Why would I use Complex Pro? So say, I guess the best example would be, do I still have that vocal?
Keeping you close. I don't know if.
Now this actually sounds like it has a bit of formant pitching stuff going on, so we're just going to do the opposite and bring it back down. So say I wanted to shift this an octave down, minus 12.
Keeping you close.
What you can hear is that it doesn't necessarily sound an octave lower because the formant is still up there. But if I pull this formant back, it's going to sound like a really deep voice.
Keeping you close.
So if you imagine this formant as either kind of what you're imagining it to sound like at the very lowest, or if you kind of wanted to keep it as close to the original sound as possible. So say on that guitar track, if I was using Complex Pro and I wanted to pitch it, and I pitch it minus 12, kind of sounds like a bass, like we're kind of leaning to that side. But if I push the formants to full, you can hear it's still trying to keep as much of that top end guitar sparkle as possible. So this is kind of how I like to use the formats, is that like the far left is your full fat transformed sound in terms of pitch, and then the far right is like as if it was trying to keep it in the same realm. So I like to use this and kind of land anywhere in between. Sometimes it's the far left or the far right. And then I use the envelope to just kind of, I don't know exactly, it just kind of brings things together. I find one very much works with the other. If you're playing with the formants, give the envelope a quick little fiddle. Either way, you'll find out which one works better. So in this case, if I had it low formant, so kind of got that bass sound, but then I pull the envelope back, or if I push the formants to the top, land like somewhere in between, and it actually sounds pretty decent. I'm halfway on the envelope, halfway on the formants, and I'm happy with that. And bear in mind, even if you're not necessarily changing the pitch, these formants and envelope are still good to play with, because depending if you're slowing down or speeding up, Ableton might want to change the formant slightly to kind of help stretch the audio. So give it a play. It might just make it sound a bit cleaner. But mainly if you're pitching audio, if you're changing the actual pitch of the audio, then this is going to be super convenient. And you can very much get that pop vocal sound.
Get me you close. I don't know it.
So you can see you get quite a few variations with just those two faders, you know, and a bit of pitch. Now, lastly, I've just got a song of mine that I'm going to be releasing soon. Hopefully you can find it online. Just want to show you what all the warp modes sound like on a full track, because at least, you know, you've got all the frequencies. There's a lot of stuff to hear, you know. It's going to try snapping onto different transients and stuff. It's going to be interesting. So let's check it out and see what they all sound like. Alright, well there you go. I hope you enjoyed that. This was a video on the Ableton warp modes. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'll happily shoot you an answer. While you're at it, hit that like and subscribe button. I really appreciate it and it really helps support the channel, so thank you very much. And once again, I've been Chris Vella and I'll see you on the next one.